One. Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Suann Yang, an associate professor at SUNY Geneseo. For this biography interview, I'm talking today with Dr. Jennifer Dean. She's an invasive species biologist with the New York Natural Heritage Program. Welcome, Jen.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And I'm excited to talk about my research and talk about these different aspects of science.
Great. We're excited to talk with you today. So Jennifer and I are really good friends. We met at Penn State when we both overlapped there doing research for a few years. Today, she's going to talk with us about a paper that she's an author on called Targeted Species Projects for Volunteers to Increase Early Detection Capacity, the Water Chestnut Mapping Challenge. It was published in the Natural Areas Journal in 2021. So today we're going to learn more about your research from that paper. We're specifically going to focus on a version of Figure 2 that you've updated for us with new observations. How does that sound?
That sounds great.
All right. Okay, could you first start out by orienting us to the map that you've redrawn for us to examine?
Sure. So this map centers on New York and Pennsylvania, which are in the Northeast United States. And the symbols here represent different types of data that are collected about water chestnut. So this is a species of an aquatic invasive plant to this area. And the orange circles represent observations made of this species, with the size of the circle correlating to the number of observations that have been made. And then those smaller yellow circles or dots represent not detected records, meaning that somebody went out looking for this species in its habitat, in this case water, and did not find it. And so this data that includes locations like this is said to be spatial data. And studying the relationship of things based on spatial data is called spatial analysis. And there are some important elements to be included in all maps, but especially when you're dealing with spatial analyses. And so on this map here, you can see that there's a legend that's focusing on the important data types that you want the viewer to know. There's also a symbol that's representing the cardinal directions. So here I have an arrow pointing north, and the east, west, and south directions can be derived from that. There's also a scale, as in that line on the bottom left, that shows how the distance in this map relates to the real distance in full size, or if you were walking it on the Earth. And I created this map using a website called iMapInvasives. This is a mapping program for collecting invasive species data, and it's used as the state invasive species database here in New York. And in the system, I went into this online and I filtered for water chestnut, and then zoomed to the level of showing the full states of Pennsylvania and New York, since the article that we're talking about was focusing on projects that occurred in both of these states.
Thanks, Jennifer. That was super helpful. That's a really cool tool. And thanks for explaining to us how to read all of those different parts of a map. That's super helpful. So now could you tell us about the work that led to the data that's shown in the map?
Sure. So just first, a little bit of background about water chestnut. So this aquatic plant species that can grow densely on the top of water bodies. And it's not native to the United States. It actually, we're thinking that its first introduction occurred in New York in the 1800s. So it's kind of radiating out from New York State. And it can cause a lot of damage to the water bodies that it occurs in, both rivers and lakes and ponds. By having this thick growth and crowding out other aquatic plants, and also preventing sunlight and oxygen from reaching the organisms beneath the water surface. And it can also make it really hard for people to enjoy being on the water, since it's nearly impossible to swim through a dense water chestnut patch or even boat through it. I've tried. It's hard to get.
It's spiky.
Yeah. If somebody catches a new population of water chestnut while it's still really small, it's actually possible to remove it by pulling it out and doing this each year to deplete the seed source. So it's really important to teach people how to identify water chestnut and be on the lookout for it. So our program here in New York and our colleagues in Pennsylvania organize these volunteer events to train citizen scientists to spot water chestnut and how to report their search efforts. so whether or not they found it, to iMapInvasives. And these water chestnut challenges encourage people to survey the water bodies familiar to them, which were often different from areas where trained professionals would typically be visiting, like the state lands and so forth. And so we compared the number of water bodies with water chestnut before these volunteer events to the number of water bodies with it right after the water chestnut challenge, and found that these targeted citizen science events can really increase the total number of water bodies surveyed. And so the data on water chestnut that's shown in this map is showing data collected by both environmental professionals and these volunteers or these citizen scientists that are collecting data to aid in research. And I would like to point out that, although it looks like a big portion of the state is just, blanketed in water chestnut, it's not that every lake or pond in those areas are actually infested. And there's actually big areas with no water chestnut at all, like up in the Adirondack Mountains up in the northeast corner of New York. And that really there are over 8,000 lakes and ponds in New York State. And at the time of this article, only 103 water bodies had detections of water chestnut. So there's still a lot to protect, even though it seems like it's everywhere sometimes.
That's great. Thanks, Jennifer. That's really cool how you have involved scientists as well as regular people in collecting the data to get all of this information that we can see here on this map. Now, would you mind taking a moment to tell us what any updates might be to your work? Are there any follow-up studies that you're working on currently?
Certainly. So currently I'm working with a master's graduate student looking at sites where people are trying to manage water chestnut infestations. So they're going out there and they're doing these water chestnut polls. So we're following up on the data of those observations, both from the professional and volunteer groups that are out there doing these management efforts. And we're taking a close look at the data entered before the management and after the management at these sites to understand why some projects are successful and they are able to get rid of the water chestnut, but others are not, and that water chestnut keeps persisting year after year. So there's different factors that could be involved, say the size or the density of the infestation at the time it was found. There could be water quality components as well. So this is ongoing, and we hope to have some interesting results in the coming year.
That's super interesting, Jennifer. I look forward to seeing what you all find out. So if we could take a step back and look at the big picture, what would you say is the significance of your research?
Well, a lot of times with science, you feel like just trained professionals can do the actual research itself. But this work really shows the power of including data that's collected by the public to complement that work from professional surveys, especially when early detection of an invasive species is key to managing it.
Thanks. That's a really important message that everyone can be involved in contributing to scientific knowledge. It doesn't matter who you are. You just have to be interested to do it. Well, now we'd like to ask you a few questions about what it's like being a scientist and your path to science. How does that sound?
That sounds great.
All right, super. So let's start out with what kinds of scientific questions interest you the most?
All right. Well, I'm very interested in using science to help our natural resource managers do their work of protecting our natural areas, whether that's our state parks or forests, rare species, and so forth. I typically use spatial data, like what we talked about earlier, from many different sources. And I also bring in information from current research done by other groups to, to consolidate that and try to translate it into practical guidance for, the people who are on the ground and doing that active management of our ecosystems.
Fantastic. Yeah, that translating knowledge into practical applications is really, really important. So for our next question, we'd like to know when and how did you know you wanted to be a scientist?
These are always the fun questions. So when I was a kid, I always loved being outside and being in the woods by the house where we grew up. And my brother and I would always wander along the creek that ran close to our neighborhood, and we'd look for little creatures in the water. And there were these really cool fossils that were common to the area in Ohio where I grew up. So I was always very curious about nature and things that were living in it. And at some point, I started noticing differences in the plants around me. And I really became obsessed with finding out the names of these different plants, and really enjoyed it. So I, found some books and things like that to help me identify things. And at the time, my only connection to science as a career were my science teachers in high school. And when I found out that one of my favorite teachers actually went to college for botany, my mind was blown. I had no idea it was an option to go to college and study plants. So during college, I was taking a lot of plant classes, and I kept looking for short-term jobs, both in some of the research labs or outside doing field work in the summer related to botany somehow. And this usually put me alongside graduate students or professors. And these were all amazing experiences that taught me about some of the different options in science.
And so it sounds like you knew you wanted to be a scientist, or you had an interest in science at an early age. And then as you gained more experience doing things in science, that helped you to see that you could have a career in science as a scientist. Well, that definitely leads me to the next question. You've talked a little bit about some of your early training. Could you tell us some more about the paths that led you to your current job?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so during my undergrad college experience, I took a lot of botany classes and really loved plants still. I knew I was in the right field. But my last semester there, I decided to take the one entomology class that was offered on campus. And I loved that as well. I had no idea that I would also like insects. And so I started getting really interested in how plants and insects interact with each other. So like pollination, those are plant-insect interactions, or herbivory, where an insect will eat a plant, or vice versa, a plant eating an insect. Very cool stuff. So that led me to grad school to get my PhD in plant-insect interactions in the entomology department. And then after grad school, I really wanted a way to use my science background to help others protect our environment. So that's where I ended up now, studying invasive species here in New York.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Jennifer. Well, we've been friends for a long time. So could I ask what it's like being a woman scientist who's also a parent?
Yeah, certainly. And so I guess growing up myself, as a girl naturally interested in science, I was really lucky to be encouraged to explore. And, I had good women role models and the teachers around me. And, as I grew in my profession, I've worked in very supportive research groups that, really respected contributions from everyone, regardless of identity, which I know I was very fortunate to be in those situations. But as a woman in the real world, I also know how common it is to be talked over or be in conversations where you're talking, but not necessarily heard. And so these are, definitely things you can encounter both in the research world or in real life as well, and, things to be aware of. And as a parent, so when I started graduate school, my daughter was just 1.5 years old. So I had a small toddler, and I knew it would be challenging. And actually, some of the programs where I interviewed seemed to convey that it would be really hard to succeed in a full-time intensive research program with family obligations at home. But I found a very supportive lab group to work with, and I found other researcher families that I could learn from, and really discovered that it is possible to juggle these different workloads in different worlds. And I found it really rewarding to raise my daughter surrounded by a community of scientists like Suann here. She had some great role models herself. But thinking about being a woman in science, one aspect in this line of work that can impact anyone, but especially women and other groups that are historically underrepresented in environmental science jobs, is personal safety while out in the field. I've spent many days alone in remote field sites and in regions where I'm not the typical person expected to be out there alone in the woods. And I would worry about things like being harassed in some form. So I always tried to stay keenly aware when other people were around, and, have learned over the years that it really helps sometimes to have like some type of official looking gear on you, like maybe a shirt or a hat with the logo of the organization you're working for, to have some kind of connection to that. And, to bring somebody along with you in the field if that's appropriate as well.
Thanks, Jennifer. Sounds like an important element of both being a parent and also a woman scientist is an awareness of your support network and developing it so that it can help you to do the things that you want to do. Right, our last question for you is simple, but maybe it'll take a moment for you to think about. Could you describe for us a moment when you felt like you really belonged in the field of science?
Yeah. So I've had some really wonderful opportunities to like participate in different science work. One that really stuck with me over the years, and probably because it was pretty early on in my careers. While I was an undergraduate, I actually had the opportunity to work for a group for a couple of years that this group provided services to a very rural and very poor region of Southeast Ohio. And among many things, this area was environmentally impacted by coal mining, which turned many of the streams bright orange and very acidic. So the water quality was quite low in this environment, or this challenged area. And I was charged as an undergrad with developing some type of project to quantify the health of the streams and involve the community somehow. And so I delved into the science and the research behind how tiny aquatic organisms called macroinvertebrates that are living in the water can actually be indicators of stream health. So I learned how to sample for these tiny organisms and how to identify them. And then I gathered resources to teach others how to do this. And I actually got some local school classes out in the field to teach them how to collect data on their own streams. And it was very satisfying to connect people to the science that they can use to participate in bettering their own environment. And, realizing now, just kind of thinking about it for this question, it was really my first journey into citizen science projects, and it's been very satisfying.
Thanks for sharing, Jennifer. That's amazing that you have actually been doing this community science work all this time. You started out with it, and now you're continuing it in lots of different ways. That's really great. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. I learned a lot. I had a lot of fun. I hope you did too. And hope that we can have some more conversations again soon.
Certainly. It was great to be able to do this. Thanks, Suann.
If you want to learn more about this work, you can read Targeted Species Projects for Volunteers to Increase Early Detection Capacity, the Water Chestnut Mapping Challenge, published in the Natural Areas Journal in 2021. We've included a link to it below this video, as well as links to iMapInvasives and the New York Natural Heritage Program, so you can learn more about those as well. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening.